Hey, folks, hope you're doing well. I wanted to take a little bit of time and touch base as a follow up from our week one time together in 502 and a little bit of a look ahead for week two that we're currently in, and then just thinking ahead to week three as well. So let me switch this over to slideshow and we'll go over just a few bits and pieces here. Let's see. Quiz number one. There were a few questions on this particular quiz that I wanted to take a moment and just touch base on to make sure that we all have a solid understanding of these. The first was a question regarding um, what it means to have an understanding of ways of representing content so that it's comprehensible to others. And so the correct answer for this is pedagogical content knowledge. So the content knowledge piece obviously refers to this representing content piece. The pedagogical piece, that's specifically referring to pedagogy. It's how we teach and why we teach. So understanding how and why we do what we do to teach content to others best describes this particular terminology in here. Whoops. So I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on what that is and how that fits in there. The next one was specifically related to accountability, and that's using those standardized tests to determine whether or not students have mastered essential knowledge. Standardized tests are going to be those big once a year types of assessments that are done in schools. So it will vary depending on the year of the student. But what happens is the results from those particular tests are utilized, for instance, at the state level to determine the overall effectiveness of education, in this case, in the state of Iowa. And so we're trying to determine how our students are doing with a broad brush stroke, understanding them as a very large whole. You don't want to use this type of standardized testing to determine the individual proficiency levels, for instance, of individual students. That this would not be a good measure of that. This is a one point in time using um, uh, materials, content, knowledge, skills that are relevant to students across the country at this grade level at this point in time. And so what it helps states do is not only to measure the effectiveness of education within their state, but it also provides them with opportunities to measure their effectiveness of education, for instance, in comparison to other states or the nation as a whole. And so when we have data like that, it's intended for purposes well above measuring individual student success. And so when we do things like that, we refer to that as accountability. Accountability also comes into play when we think about federal grant types of monies or the federal level Department of Education. When they come out with specific expectations or requirements. No Child Left Behind would be a great example of a federal level of legislation aimed at accountability. And so I just wanted to take some time and talk through that piece a little bit. And then the last one, there's a question about reforms in teacher education being implemented all over the state or all over the nation. And so obviously, all five of these actually do apply to teacher education across the nation. The one I really wanted to take a little bit of time and just touch base on, actually, there's a couple of them because it depends. Number one, in particular, raising standards for admission into teacher training programs. I might argue that in some states, the opposite might be happening. For instance, there's legislation right now in the state of Iowa about eliminating praxis testing for content knowledge. So, good, bad, or other, I would deem that to be something that is lowering the standards a little bit for admission into teacher training programs. So that might be one that we could make an argument for or against. Same thing with expanding teacher prep programs from 4 to 5 years. I suspect that was probably more prevalent 5, 10 years ago. And I suspect the opposite is now occurring simply because of supply and demand in the world of education right now. There is not as great a supply of teachers as there is a demand for them. And so states are making changes to try and address the needs that school districts have for qualified teachers in their classrooms. And so you are all experiencing some of that. You're living it right now. But ultimately, the way our text was defining reforms in teacher education, all five of these do apply. And so I just wanted to point those out a little bit. The other thing I wanted to touch base on, our first few chapters that we've been reading talk a lot about socioeconomic status. And I've included a link in at the bottom of, oh, sorry, I can't remember if it's module 1 or module 2, but it's an actual link to this book, Eric Jensen's Teaching with Poverty in Mind. The ebook version of it is available through our library. It's a quick read, very straightforward. I would highly recommend that you take an hour at some point in time and skim through this particular book. Eric Jensen does a fabulous job of helping, just helping practitioners understand the impact that poverty has on our students. And it's not only poverty; it's all of those impacts of SES. And how that impacts our learners, but also strategies that we can implement to better support them. And he has some very practical ideas, some great little case studies, and then some very practical ideas that you can implement in the classrooms. And so, if you've got some time, I strongly recommend taking a look at this particular book. It will be well worth your while and will give you lots of ideas for strategies that you might want to implement in your classroom in the future. In fact, here's just a few things from chapter 1. When I read this not too long ago, some things that I was picking up as just kind of those aha moments. And this is just from chapter 1. For instance, on page 11, he talks about how toddler vocabularies in a middle SES family are higher than the mothers of a low SES family. So just think about that for a moment. He also highlights the fact that there is no such thing as inherited laziness, which I think is important to remember. We cannot make the assumption that a student is lazy. Let's peel back the layers and find out what else is going on in their lives, because there are many factors that could be impacting the behavior of a student, and we really do need to get to the bottom of it rather than just trying to address the surface level things that we are noticing in the classroom. Another page 13, he talks about how who you are and how you teach both have an impact on low SES students. Page 14 talks about teacher support and how essential it really is to these students. He highlights on page 17 impulsivity in students that might be living in an environment of low SES. Sometimes they can be misdiagnosed, for instance, with ADHD, but it could just be a survival instinct on their part. I love page 7 and how he highlights the fact that 5 years of really good teaching can close these gaps entirely. There's also another statistic somewhere, and I believe he has it in his book as well, that 3 years of very poor teaching could create a gap that students will never be able to overcome. So it's really important that, as new teachers, we have you as prepared as you possibly can be to hit the ground running so that you're one of those 5 years of really good teaching that these kids need. And then page 12 highlights the fact that lack of student effort may mean that you're not engaging them enough. And that's something to really reflect on. If you're noticing that your students are just not engaged, you have to stop and think about what's going on in their lives and what you're doing with your teaching and how you might better meet their needs. And again, this book is going to give you some fabulous ideas. So you might want to just go ahead and take a peek at it at some point in time. Coming up in week 3, we are doing a teacher interview assignment. And so this is one of those pieces I wanted to just touch base on and make sure that you've got your eye on this one, just because it might take you a little bit of time to track down a teacher because you're going to be interviewing a teacher. We have some guiding questions. You are more than welcome to step outside of those guided questions, but I would really make sure that these in particular are addressed as part of your conversation. And then you'll be thinking about the teacher's responses and how those might align to the educational philosophies that we've been learning about. And then just write a 1 to 2 page paper, double space it. I'm not so worried about font, but describe your interview and the connections that you're making between that interview and an educational philosophy. And we have those philosophies saved in module 3 so that you can go ahead and take a look at that. I know it says to save the paper as a PDF. It really doesn't matter to me. I'm very comfortable working with any format. So please feel free to upload a format that works for you. I have no problems with that at all. And then there is a grading rubric right in there as well. So you can go ahead and take a look at that. The other piece that is in module 3 is a draft of your own teaching philosophy. This interview will give you a good start to thinking about that. And just know that the assignment for your teaching philosophy that's due in week 3 is really intended to be a draft. Just start getting your ideas on paper based on the guidelines that I've provided you with. And it will get you headed in the right direction so that by the end of our time together this summer, you will have a well crafted teaching philosophy. And you'll be surprised at how well that likely defines you as a teacher. I'm going to turn that off because I've always been amazed just reading teaching philosophies. When you start thinking about it, when you take the time early on here to really think about who you are as an educator and then revisit it in a couple of years, you may tweak a few things, but ultimately, a lot of who you are, what you believe in, are starting very early on here. So it's important to develop a good understanding of what these philosophies are and what they mean about you as an educator, so that you can really tap into those. Teach to your strengths. Be thinking about that, but also think about them, how those strengths can support learners in your classroom as you're continuing to move through your journey towards teacher education. And that's all I have. I'm going to keep it short and sweet right now. I'll follow up with more information later, but have a great rest of the day and enjoy your weekend. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.